Imagine two states born from the same colony, sharing not only a border but also the same coastline, climate, and even part of their name. For centuries, their stories have run side by side, their fates tied to the same wars, the same plantations, and the same shifting tides of American history. At first glance, it would be easy to assume that their destinies must also be alike. Yet the numbers tell a different story. Today, one of these states hums with more than 11 million residents, its cities stretching outward in a patchwork of highways, suburbs, and economic hubs. The other counts just over 5 million people, a population scarcely half the size. Despite the surface-level similarities, their demographic paths have diverged dramatically, and the smaller, less populated of the pair is South Carolina. This sharp divide invites a deeper look. If South Carolina and its northern counterpart were cut from the same colonial cloth, why has one surged ahead while the other lagged behind? Why have families seeking opportunity, businesses chasing growth, and migrants in search of a new home been drawn so much more strongly to the north? To find an answer, we must look more closely at the forces that have guided their development across the centuries and why so few people live in South Carolina. Geography and natural resources. At first glance, South Carolina seems to have drawn the better hand when it comes to geography. Its coastline is dotted with wide sandy beaches, navigable harbors, and fertile lowlands that once powered its plantation economy. Charleston, founded in 1670, became one of the most important port cities in early America, thanks to its deep harbor and easy access to Atlantic trade. In contrast, North Carolina's coast was broken up by the treacherous Outer Banks, a maze of shifting sandbars, shallow sounds, and dangerous inlets that made large-scale port development nearly impossible. Early European colonists even nicknamed North Carolina the graveyard of the Atlantic, because so many ships wrecked along its shores. On the surface, South Carolina had a more promising start. But geography is about more than just ports and beaches. What truly set the states apart was what lay inland. North Carolina's Piedmont region stretches wide across the middle of the state, offering rolling hills, rich soil, and plentiful fresh water. Rivers like the Cape Fear, Neuse, and Roanoke carried not only water, but also opportunities for agriculture, settlement, and later industrial power. The Piedmont proved ideal for towns and cities to grow, and over time it became the engine of North Carolina's development, first through farming, then textiles and furniture, and eventually banking and technology. South Carolina's Piedmont, by comparison, is far smaller. Much of the state transitions quickly from coastal plains to the Blue Ridge foothills, leaving less space for large inland cities to emerge and thrive. The mountains tell a similar story. North Carolina boasts the tallest peaks east of the Mississippi, with Mount Mitchell rising 6,684 feet. These ranges create a cooler climate, abundant forests, and headwaters for many rivers. They also became a magnet for tourism and outdoor recreation in the modern era. South Carolina's share of the Appalachians is tiny by comparison, with Sassafras Mountain at just over 3,500 feet. While scenic, it never had the same ecological, economic, or cultural weight as North Carolina's mountain region. Therefore, South Carolina's geography was ideal for a coastal plantation economy, but it left little room for inland urban expansion once that system collapsed. Do you think South Carolina would have been more developed if the inland terrain had been as favorable as North Carolina? Or are cultural and economic differences the key factor? Historical development and economy. In the colonial and antebellum eras, South Carolina stood as one of the richest places in North America. The tidal rivers and marshlands of its lowcountry provided the perfect environment for rice and indigo cultivation, crops that required large plantations and, most importantly, enslaved labor. By the 1700s, Charleston had become a hub of wealth and aristocracy, its elite planters connected directly to transatlantic trade routes. South Carolina was not just wealthy, it was among the wealthiest colonies in the British Empire. But this prosperity was built on a narrow foundation: one crop economy, one coastal port, and one deeply entrenched social order. That concentration came at a cost. Because wealth was locked in the plantations, little incentive existed to foster widespread industry, small farms, or inland cities. Much of the state's interior remained sparsely settled, overshadowed by Charleston and the Rice Coast. Education, infrastructure, and economic diversification lagged far behind, as the planter elite had little reason to invest in broader development. The reliance on slavery also meant the population was disproportionately rural and bound to the rhythms of agriculture rather than the dynamism of trade and manufacturing. When the Civil War brought slavery and the plantation system to an end, South Carolina's economy collapsed more dramatically than most. The very foundation of its wealth evaporated almost overnight, leaving little else to fall back on. Neighboring North Carolina, by contrast, had never been so tied to a single plantation system. Its smaller farms and more dispersed settlements were better positioned to adapt. Over time, that adaptability made all the difference. South Carolina did eventually industrialize, especially in textiles, but the shift came later and slower than in the Piedmont of North Carolina. Without a diversified base of cities and industries, growth remained limited. Charleston continued as a cultural jewel, and smaller cities like Columbia and Greenville rose in importance, but none reached the scale or influence of Charlotte, Raleigh, or Durham. The heavy dependence on a plantation economy in its formative years had locked South Carolina into a trajectory that proved difficult to escape. Urbanization and migration patterns. Another reason is that South Carolina's economic choices in its early centuries left a long shadow over its cities. Unlike states that nurtured multiple large urban centers, South Carolina relied almost entirely on Charleston as its dominant hub. The wealth of the Lowcountry planters created a vibrant port city, but it did little to spark inland urban growth. Much of the interior remained rural, dotted with farms and mill towns, but lacking the infrastructure or population density to develop into true metropolitan areas. When industrialization swept across the American South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, South Carolina found itself disadvantaged. The textile mills that did emerge in places like Greenville and Spartanburg offered jobs, but they did not generate the kind of large-scale urban expansion that could attract waves of migrants. Meanwhile, the collapse of the plantation economy meant that many rural residents, especially African Americans, left the state entirely during the Great Migration, heading north to cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit in search of better opportunities. Instead of drawing people in, South Carolina was steadily losing them. By contrast, North Carolina's wider Piedmont provided fertile ground for multiple growing cities. Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Durham all expanded with industry, universities, and finance. These cities became magnets for both domestic and international migrants, creating a cycle of growth that reinforced itself over the decades. South Carolina, with fewer urban centers and a slower industrial transition, simply could not compete on the same scale. Even today, the legacy is clear. South Carolina's largest metropolitan areas, Greenville, Columbia, and Charleston, remain relatively modest by national standards, each under 1 million people. They are dynamic and growing, but they cannot rival the economic pull of Charlotte's banking sector or Raleigh's research and technology industries just across the border. Without comparable urban magnets, South Carolina has consistently attracted fewer people, leaving it with barely half the population of its northern neighbor. Modern economy and infrastructure. In the modern era, the population gap between the two Carolinas has only widened because of differences in economic diversification and infrastructure. South Carolina has made strides, attracting auto manufacturers like BMW near Spartanburg and Boeing in the Charleston area, but these developments are relatively recent and concentrated. The state's economy remains narrower, leaning heavily on manufacturing, tourism, and agriculture. These industries generate jobs, but they do not produce the same breadth of high-paying opportunities that drive large-scale migration. North Carolina, by contrast, moved earlier and more aggressively into industries with lasting growth potential. The creation of the Research Triangle Park in the 1950s linked Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill into a hub for technology, research, and education, drawing in talent and investment from across the country. Charlotte grew into the second-largest banking center in the United States, a magnet for finance, corporate headquarters, and supporting industries. Together, these urban engines created an economy that could attract not just workers, but also entire families and new communities. Infrastructure reinforced this divergence. North Carolina invested heavily in interstate highways and international airports, giving its cities greater connectivity to the rest of the country and the world. Charlotte Douglas International Airport is now one of the busiest in the nation, while Raleigh-Durham International has become a gateway for research and tech industries. South Carolina's airports, though growing, remain smaller, limiting global access. Its highway system is also less extensive, which makes cities like Columbia and Greenville feel more regionally bound rather than nationally connected. The result is a cycle that feeds on itself. Stronger economic diversity brings more migrants, which justifies greater investment in infrastructure, which in turn makes the state even more attractive. South Carolina, while growing quickly by national standards, has struggled to keep pace with this momentum. Without the same economic engines or transportation networks, it remains half the size of its northern neighbor, an echo of choices and patterns that stretch back centuries. If you are interested in interesting comparisons like this, please subscribe to discover more surprising stories about the world around us. The population gap between the two Carolinas is no accident. South Carolina's dependence on plantation wealth in its earliest centuries left the state with fewer inland cities, weaker infrastructure, and less economic diversity. When the Civil War ended that system, the loss hit harder than in North Carolina, which had always maintained a broader base of farms, industries, and towns. Over the following decades, the difference only grew clearer. North Carolina invested in research, finance, and urban growth, while South Carolina's economy remained more limited in scale and scope. And this story is just one example of how unexpected twists in history can reshape entire regions. Follow along to discover more fascinating insights and unusual stories from around the world.